book here for a second. July 4th, 1969. Up until that point in my life, in conformance with King Frederick II's prescription against the inebriation among falconers, which I had not talked about. You were a falconer, and you had started hunting with falcons and other birds. And this guy, King Frederick II, had all these rules that you were following. I had resolved to never use drugs or alcohol. In fact, I'd never even tasted coffee. However, I'd recently gathered from my favorite comic book, Rock, Son of Stone, that hallucinogens might allow me to see dinosaurs, which I greatly desired. Jeff O'Neill assured me that this was a near certainty. So I swallowed the LSD, which more than delivered on his promise. Buildings melted like wax candles, trees bowed and swayed on a windless night. Bright lights with long comet tails lent Hyannisport the cheery aura of Christmas in July. Still tripping, I rode into Hyannis with two older kids struggled in a Main Street diner with a plate of lively white noodles that squirmed and squeaked as I stabbed at them with my fork. I became suddenly appreciative of the impossibly complex choreography of minute movements required by my mouth and its various parts in order to chew and swallow food. Abandoning that endeavor, I looked up to see a picture hanging behind the counter of my father, Uncle Jack, and Jesus. All of them had their hands folded in prayer. Until that moment, everything had been a delight. My soul was happy with this strange new adventure, and I was laughing along with my friends. Now, things turned sour. I greatly admired all three of those fellows, and I doubted that any of them would have approved of my hallucinogens. A pall came over me. What was I doing? My father had been practically a teetotaler, a straight arrow. His personal life was beyond reproach. He had sacrificed his life to a higher purpose, and here I was high on drugs. I left my friends and walked the 3 miles back to Hyannisport, swearing I would never do drugs again. By then it was morning, and I was in a funk, wondering how I was going to explain my all-night absence and cope with my exhaustion. A few blocks from my home, I ran into a group of boys who prescribed me a line of methadone. And that snort miraculously solved all my problems for that day. So, thus begins a period of your life with drugs.
Yeah, so my what they call progression was very, very fast. Within several weeks, I was shooting heroin. And I did that from when I was 15 years old to when I was 28, and I got sober at 28. But, virtually all that time, I was taking drugs against my own conscience. So I was trying to stop. I was constantly making vows, making efforts to stop, but I couldn't do it. And the weird thing was, for me, that I had iron willpower in other parts of my life. I gave up candy for Lent when I was 13, and I never ate it again until I was in college. I gave up desserts the next year, and for Lent, I never had another dessert till I was in college. I was playing sports, I was playing rugby, and was trying to bulk up, so I started eating desserts again. And I felt I could do anything with willpower. And yet, this compulsion was completely impervious to anything that I threw at it. I could make a resolve and stay sober for a week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, but then I'd be doing it again. And the most demoralizing feature of this illness, of addiction, for me was my incapacity to keep contracts with myself. I would tell myself at 9 o'clock in the morning, earnestly, sincerely, honestly, I am never going to do that again. And at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, I'd be doing it. It was like somebody else had stepped into my body and was now manipulating the gears and driving the rig. And I had no capacity to bind that person with anything that I said earlier. And I struggled like that for 14 years. I'm not saying it was all bad, because I had a lot of fun during that period, and I did a lot of wild things. And but I was always trying to stop. And, particularly toward the end, it became miserable. It's like dancing with a gorilla. It's really fun and exhilarating in the beginning, and then, you realize that you're dancing until the gorilla tells you he's ready to stop.
Yeah, you end up, and again, a bunch of this is the stuff from the book. You get kicked out of a couple schools. You get arrested with your cousin in 1970 for marijuana possession. You end up you graduate in 1972 from high school. You go to Harvard. You graduate from Harvard. You end up getting your law degree from University of Virginia. You get sworn in as the assistant district attorney for Manhattan. You get married. You fail your bar exam, which is interesting. How'd you fail your bar exam?
At 1 point.
Okay, fair enough.
659 out of 660. The weird thing about heroin for me is that it made me. I was very bad in school when I was a kid. I had ADHD, and the voice of the teachers just sounded like a foreign language to me. I couldn't understand anything. I couldn't sit still. My mind was racing all the time, and I couldn't read. I just could not sit still in my head or physically. I was always moving. And when I started doing narcotics, I went from the bottom of my class to the top of my class. So I was either the first or second in my class at every school I went to after I started doing narcotics. And it allowed me to get into Harvard. It allowed me to flourish. And if it still worked, I'd still be doing it. It stopped working for me, and it also was destroying my life in other ways.
Well, yeah, most people don't get off that train. I mean, most people don't get off the heroin train alive, right?
I don't know most, but I would say that's probably a good guess. That and particularly these days, I think, with the advent of the age of fentanyl, you're much more likely to die than you are to get sober. Mm-hmm. I was lucky. I had in 1983, at the end of 1983, when I went to a rehab, and I had a spiritual awakening that freed me from addiction. So it's almost like, for me, it was like a miracle, like almost as if I could walk on water. It would be that shocking, because I had really tried. And then suddenly it was just lifted. It was like as if it never had happened, as if I never had the compulsion. And I had, I knew that I wanted to have the only thing that was going to save me was a profound spiritual realignment, that I had to change in some fundamental way the person that I was, because I was an addict. I was a junkie, and if I didn't change in a very, very fundamental way who I was, that I was going to either be white-knuckling it for the rest of my life and fighting the impulse, which would have been a miserable existence, or I was going to find some way to make myself into a normal person, just a guy who wakes up in the morning and is not thinking of heroin all day and cocaine. And I had a couple of things happen to me. One is, first of all, I'd read the lives of the saints, because we did that every night when we were kids. So I knew that there were templates, there were examples of people who, throughout history, who had these very decadent lives, like St. Augustine was one, till he was 30 years old. His mother was St. Monica, and she prayed for him every day till he was 30, and he was a whoremonger. He was living with prostitutes. He was a sex addict. He was a total alcoholic. And at the age of 30, he transformed. He became the most important figure, and one of the most important figures in the history of Christianity. Saint Francis of Assisi, the same thing. He was, he led a rather debauched life. He was a soldier, and he was a party guy. He was a musician, and he was a party guy. And then he had this spiritual transformation. Saint Paul had the same thing. Everybody knows at Damascus. But I also had a personal experience because I had a friend. Two of my brothers died from this disease, David and Michael, in ways that were as a direct result, ultimately, of this disease. One of them had an overdose, the other in a ski accident. But one of them, my brother David had a friend who was one of his best friends who had the same level of addiction that I did and that David did, and took drugs with the same enthusiasm and compulsion and, recklessness and out of control. And he became a Mooney. So he joined the Unification Church and became a follower of Reverend Sun Myung Moon. And he didn't want to take drugs anymore. And he would still hang out with us, but he would be chattering about his new life, and we could take drugs right in front of him, and he was indifferent to them. And I used to think about him, and I think to myself when I was getting sober, I think I'd rather be dead than be a Mooney, because that's the kind of narrow, view that I had of life at that point. But I wish somehow I could distill whatever it was that gave him this imperviousness to the compulsion without turning into a religious nuisance. And at the same time, I picked up this book by Carl Jung. And Carl Jung was, one of the fathers of modern psychiatry, and Freud was his mentor. But Freud wanted him to be his successor, but he had a big difference with Freud. Freud was an atheist, and Jung was a deeply spiritual man. His father had been a preacher. Interestingly, his father never had a genuine, authentic spiritual experience, and was just kind of very, very good at repeating at rote the shibboleths and, sort of consensual, language and vernacular of religious beliefs. And he was very good at it, but he never believed it. And he ended up, and meanwhile, Jung himself began having genuine spiritual experience when he was 3 or 4 years old. His biography is extraordinary because he has perfect memory. And he was having dreams then that were, very significant, but also these other spiritual things that happened to him. And I'll tell you one of the things that happened in this book. Jung spent a lot of time thinking not only about mental health, but also of how to induce profound spiritual experiences. And the book that I read is called Synchronicity, and synchronicity means a coincidence, essentially. It's one of these things that happens to us, like if you're talking about somebody that you haven't thought about in 20 years, and the phone rings and it's that person on the phone. And these kind of things happen to us all the time, right? And we can either dismiss them and say, oh, that's just a coincidence. But he would put significance into them. And he thought this was a way that God broke his own rules that he set up when he put the universe in spinning. The rules of mathematics, the rules of science, the rules of biology, and that God was, and the rules of chance, and God was breaking those rules to come in and kind of tap us on the shoulder and say, I'm here and I'm watching stuff, and I'm interested in you particularly. I'm showing you these kind of little miracles where the rules of the universe are shattered. So he ran the biggest sanitarium in Europe, and he's sitting with his back to the window, and he's talking to a female patient, who's sharing a dream with him, and he was very big on dreams. And the dream is about the central fulcrum of the dream is a scarab beetle, and which is a creature that has these profound kind of spiritual significance. It's very common iconography on the tombs, the hieroglyphics, on the obelisks and the tombs of Egypt. But it's almost unknown in Northern Europe, where he was. He was in Zurich in Switzerland. And so he's talking to her, and she's telling him about this scarab beetle dream, and he's hearing this ping, ping, ping on the window behind him. And it's irritating him, but he doesn't want to turn his attention away from his patient. So he maintains his posture for a while, but then it became so exasperating to him that he gets up and he throws the window open, and a scarab beetle flies in and lands in his palm. And he turns to her and says, "Is this what you were talking about?" So, and those kind of things happen to him all the time. In his biography, which is called Dreams, Memories, and something else, which is, if anybody wants to read about Jung, they should read his biography. They should not read Synchronicity, which was the one that was much more difficult to read. But so he saw these as divine interventions, and what he tried to do is he tried to reproduce that phenomena in a clinical setting. So he would put one guy in one room and another guy in another room, and he'd have them flip cards. And then guess what the other guy had flipped. And he believed that if he could beat the laws of percentages, the laws of chance, the laws of mathematics, that way he would have proven the existence of a supernatural force, because this was beyond the laws of nature. And if you could beat the laws of nature, then you could say there's something out there that we cannot explain through the laws of nature, and that was the first step in proving the existence of a God, which he was a very spiritual man, but he was also a very faithful scientist. So he's trying to use these tools to prove the existence of God. Well, he fails. He can't do it. And he says in the book that he could not use empirical tools or scientific tools to demonstrate the existence of a God. But he then said this. He said, having seen tens of thousands of patients come through his sanitarium, that he could prove that people who believed in God got better faster, and that their recovery was more durable than people who did not. And that statement had a profound impact on me, much more profound than if he had said and he had proved the existence of a God, which I would not have believed, right? But what he was saying is, it's irrelevant if there's a God up there. If you believe in him, your chance of getting sober are much higher than if you don't believe. And for me, I had already made a vow to myself that I was going to do anything that improved by even 1% my chances of staying sober. So, I made an intellectual decision. I'm going to start believing in God. And then I confronted, the universal dilemma, which is, how do you start believing in something that you can't see or smell or touch or taste or hear or acquire with your senses? And and Jung answers that question. He says, fake it till you make it. Act as if that the compliance will precede the evidence. Then once you start complying and living like you're somebody who believes, pretending you believe, you'll actually start seeing evidence that will put that supposition beyond any reasonable doubt. So that's what I did. I just said, okay, I'm going to pretend there's a God up there, that he's looking at me the whole time, and that everything that I do is kind of a moral choice, has a moral dimension to it. And I began breaking and that I had to behave myself even when I didn't have an audience, and even when I didn't have eyewitnesses. So I started breaking my day down into about 40 different decisions. And each one has a moral implication. When the alarm goes off in the morning, do I get out of bed immediately, or do I lie in bed for another 15 minutes with my indolent thoughts? Do I hang up the towels when I go? Do I make my bed? That's the most important thing every day. Even when I'm staying at a hotel now, I make my bed, which is ridiculous. It's crazy to do that, but I do it because it's part of building character, which is what we're doing here. We're not here to build a pile for ourselves, and whoever dies with the most stuff wins. We're here to build character, which is the only thing that is enduring, that's durable, that will survive our own lives. And you do that by making the bed even when you don't need to, by doing the right thing even when somebody's not looking at you. So do I put the water in the ice tray before I put the ice tray back in the freezer? Do I, when I reach into my closet and I pull out a pair of blue jeans and all those little wire hangers fall on the floor of the closet, do I go in there and say, because what I used to do is say, hey, I got a lot to do today. I am too important for that job. That's somebody else's job. And I'd shut the closet door. And I left a lot of those closed closets all day long, for other people to do, right? And so now I go in there and I hang them all up, even if I'm in a rush. When I put the shopping cart back where it's supposed to go, And I remember when I first got sober, my life had gotten very, very small, which is what happens. You get isolated, you get small from addiction. And when I got sober, my life started getting big very quickly. And I was running through National Airport, and I was late for a plane. It was mission critical. I don't even remember what it was, but the apocalypse was going to happen if I didn't make that plane. And I was late and was already going to miss it. And as I was running, I was putting a piece of dentine in my mouth, and I wrapped the wrapper up, and I was running, and I threw the wrapper into a garbage can and make a perfect arc right into the center swish of the can. But I noticed through the corner of my eye that it must have hit something in there and jumped back out. I was like, well, that's God's fault because I made the shot, right? So I come running. But then I got about 40 or 50 feet down that down the terminal, and it just started eating at me. And I put on the brakes, and I went back and put that little piece of garbage back in the can, and I still made my plane. But the most important thing that day was, that I did was to do that. That little task is the most important thing I did on that day, because the whole challenge with life, and both sobriety, but also life, is how do we stay in that posture of surrender, of humility? How do we stay there even when the cash and prizes are flowing in and people are telling you how great you are and you got everything going for you? And that's when I want to say to God, thank you, God, I got it from here, and take the wheel and drive the car off the cliff again. You know what I mean?
Yeah, gotta watch out for that one. How long did the spiritual awakening take? Like, how long were you in rehab for?
I had it from when I made that decision. I'll tell you what happened to me. I went out, I finished that book, and by the time I finished that book, I had made a decision. I'm going to turn my life over to God. Okay, whatever that means, however I find him. And so I made that decision. And then I close that book, and I go out, these rehabs, they have a lot of volleyball, and we went out to play volleyball. And during that volleyball game, somebody hit a ball on a very, very powerful punch. It went way up in the air, and then it came down, and it hit the top of the post where the net was tied. And it started up again, and I said out loud, so everybody heard me, I said, that ball's going to get hit by a Mack truck. So then the ball goes up again on this kind of errant flight. It lands right dead on the center of a chain link fence, and it topples over the other side onto a driveway, and it rolls down the grade about probably 40 or 50 feet into the middle of a thoroughfare. And a big 18-wheel diesel with a bulldog on the hood comes and pops, and it goes bang, a big resounding pop. And everybody there just looked at me and said, how did you know that? It was just a moment. But I was like, okay, this is, and I had just finished that book about synchronicity. So I said, I felt like, I was being tapped on the shoulder. And I said, I can either just say that was a coincidence and walk away, or I can see God in it, and I can be grateful and thankful and joyful, that I got to see it so soon, and now I see those things every day in my life. I rely on them. And as long as I stay in that posture of surrender, I have miracles in my life all the time. And it's like, my life before I figured this all out was all activity and no progress. I had a lot of ambition. I was like a big truck, that has headers and the pipes that are spitting fire and smoke, and the engine revving and the wheels spinning, stuck in a ditch going nowhere. But a lot of energy going into it and a lot of activity, getting stuff right to the end of the goal line and never getting across. And all of that. And now, when you connect to that higher vibrations, to that spiritual side, then, it's almost like you can put down the oars and hoist the sails, and that you're being propelled. And it's like judo, because, if you apply the effort toward your spiritual condition, then it pays off in all these other ways that just don't, in the reality that we live in, they don't seem connected, but they are. If you can stay in that high vibration, just good things happen.
So you get sober, and then you kind of...
Let me give you another metaphor just while I'm thinking that just occurred to me. When I was a kid, sometimes I'd pick a flower, like a rose that was still in the bud, and then try to unfold it. And it never looks right, And a lot of times you have to just learn to be still. You do your job, which is watering the flower, but otherwise you leave it alone. And, I remember when I got out of the rehab, I read a line from Isaiah that said, "Be still and know that I am God." And that had a huge impact on me, of learning to be still is so much, because my life before was, including drugs, it's about, feeling discomfort and then having to fix it somehow. And, growing up is about learning to live with this discomfort and just experience it like dark clouds on the horizon, that it's going to come through, and that you just have to experience it and let it keep flowing, and there's nothing to do about it, and learning to be still, learning to be indifferent to pain, learning to be indifferent to pleasure, to desire. Those should be ultimately the ambition of an enlightened, of a spiritual enlightenment.
Now, your next phase in life, which is a long phase, is this environmental